The first pop. Pop! A kernel of corn just exploded. The man sitting by the fire stared at it for a few seconds. A strange white piece had landed on the ground. The man picked up another kernel. He placed it near the fire. Pop! Another one exploded. The man looked at the kernel. Then he looked at the fire. And he probably thought, "Wait, was that on purpose?" He picked up a third kernel. He put it near the fire. Pop! Okay, now it couldn't be completely random. But there was a more important question. Could you eat this white thing? We don't know that man's name. We don't even know if he was actually the first person to ever do this. But we do know that popcorn is very, very old. Way before restaurants. Way before recipes. Way before microwaves. And definitely way before anyone could write on a bag. Open carefully. On the northern coast of Peru, archaeologists have found remains of corn at sites like Paredones and Huaca, Prieta. Some of this evidence dates back around 6,700 years. And this corn wasn't just being used for flour or ordinary food. Evidence suggests people there were eating varieties of corn that could pop, which means humans were eating popcorn thousands of years before movie theaters existed. And now the real question begins. How did they first figure out that these kernels could explode? The accident? This is where we have to make a little guess. Because no human 6,700 years ago was sitting around writing a diary that said, "Today, a corn kernel exploded." So we don't know exactly how the first pop was discovered. But there's a very logical scenario. Fire. A kernel of corn may have fallen near the flames. At first, nothing happened. It was just a dry little kernel sitting beside the fire. A few seconds passed. Then, pop! A kernel that had been small and hard moments ago suddenly turned into a strange, white fluffy piece. But now there was a problem. This human had to decide whether to eat the strange white thing. Because from his perspective, it could have been a new food, or a white rock, or even something that was better left completely alone. But humans have one dangerous characteristic. When we find something strange, we usually want to test it. So someone probably picked up another kernel, put it near the fire again. Pop! He put another one there. Pop! Now everyone knew these kernels had a secret. Someone probably eventually picked up the first piece of popcorn and ate it. And if they were lucky, nothing bad happened. Instead, they probably discovered that something that had been a dry little kernel a few seconds earlier was now softer and puffed up. And that tiny moment could have been the beginning of a food that would survive for thousands of years. Why does popcorn explode? But wait! Why does corn actually explode? This is where popcorn has a little trick hidden inside it. Every popcorn kernel is basically a tiny pressure chamber. There's a small amount of water inside the kernel, and around it is a hard outer shell. When the kernel heats up, the water inside starts turning into steam. But the steam can't easily escape through the shell. So the pressure inside the kernel rises. More, and more, until the shell can't handle the pressure anymore. Boom! The kernel bursts open. The starch inside shoots outward, and it creates that white, fluffy shape we know today. So popcorn is basically a tiny edible explosion. Except nobody calls the fire department afterward. But now we have an even more interesting question. Why don't all corn kernels pop? Because not every type of corn is suitable for making popcorn. The kernel needs the right amount of moisture. Its outer shell also needs to hold the pressure inside for a while. If the shell has a crack, the steam escapes. And instead of pop, you might just get a dry, boring kernel. In simple terms, popcorn needs water. It needs a strong shell, and it needs enough heat. When those three things come together, you get the little explosion we love. Now imagine that ancient humans knew none of this science. All they saw was a kernel being heated and suddenly exploding. So they probably started experimenting. Throw this one into the fire. Heat this one longer. Popcorn gets weird. And then humans discovered that popcorn wasn't just for eating. In some Native American cultures, popcorn was also used in ceremonies and decorations. Historical sources about the Aztecs also mention a type of popcorn called mamakil. So a kernel of corn that had originally just exploded near a fire was now becoming part of human culture. And then humans started finding even stranger ways to make it. One of the strangest methods involved hot sand. Historical accounts about the Iroquois in North America describe popping corn kernels using heated sand in a clay vessel. So instead of simply saying, "Throw the corn into the fire," someone basically said, "Let's heat some sand too." And somehow, it actually worked. The hot sand transferred heat to the kernels. The kernels heated up. The pressure inside increased. And then, pop! Another one. Pop! And another. Pop! If someone suggested using sand to make popcorn today, we'd probably ask, "Are you sure about this?" But thousands of years ago, humans had to experiment with different ways of making it. And that curiosity helped popcorn slowly become more than just a simple food. Centuries passed, cooking methods improved. People discovered they could prepare it in different kinds of containers. And popcorn slowly became something that could be sold. But the big moment still hadn't arrived. Popcorn was about to become connected to something that had absolutely nothing to do with corn. Movies. And this is where the story gets really weird. Because popcorn wasn't even supposed to go inside movie theaters at first. From fire to cinema. In the early days of cinema, some theater owners really didn't want people eating popcorn inside their theaters. The reason wasn't complicated. It made crumbs. It smelled. It was messy. And to some theater owners, popcorn wasn't exactly the kind of food you wanted in a fancy theater. But people were buying popcorn outside movie theaters. Then they brought it inside. Because when something is cheap and delicious, unwritten rules disappear pretty quickly. Vendors also realized that the area outside a movie theater was a great place to sell popcorn. Then commercial popcorn machines entered the story. One important moment came at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. That's where Charles Cretors demonstrated his steam-powered popcorn machine. And suddenly, popcorn wasn't just an ancient food anymore. It was becoming a real business. Then the 1930s arrived. The Great Depression. People didn't have much money for entertainment. But going to the movies was still a relatively cheap form of entertainment. And popcorn? It was even cheaper than the movie ticket. Vendors started selling popcorn near movie theaters. Then, little by little, the theaters themselves realized something interesting was happening. People wanted popcorn. And theaters could make money from it. The thing that used to be a nuisance had now become an important source of income. Popcorn was no longer an unwanted guest at the movies. It was becoming the landlord. And the relationship became so strong that today, when you walk into a movie theater and smell popcorn, your brain almost says, "Okay, you can't watch this movie without popcorn." Even if the price of one bucket sometimes makes you wonder if they popped the corn using actual gold. But popcorn still had one more stage to go through. Popcorn machines got better. Packaging got better. More flavors appeared. And then the microwave arrived. Now you didn't have to sit beside a fire. You didn't have to find hot sand. You didn't even have to know how to cook. You just put the bag inside the machine and wait for that familiar sound. Pop! And suddenly, the same thing that happened thousands of years ago